How is it going, guys, and welcome to the Olufemi channel. We're a group of teachers that want to shore up your video production skills in as little time as possible. Guys, today Coffeelicker is going to be showing you how to make face filters in After Effects.
Yo, it's Herman here, and I'm excited to teach you how you can accurately track creative filters onto your live footage with the amazing PowerMesh feature like what you see here. So what exactly is PowerMesh and what's Mocha Pro? Don't I already have Mocha if I have After Effects? Let me explain. And buckle up because there's quite a bit of information that we're gonna go over, but I'm gonna try and break everything down as clear as possible. The Mocha that's been included in After Effects for many years is called Mocha AE, and it's well known for how powerful its planar tracking is. Planar tracking means it excels in tracking flat objects like walls, billboards, computer screens, etc. Now Mocha Pro is the paid version of Mocha that's an absolute monster with its many additional features like advanced rotoing, object removal, and stabilization, just to name a few. And it even supports running in Premiere Pro, so you can track and mask in there instead of going back and forth into After Effects, because have you tried masking natively in Premiere Pro? It's not fun. Now, PowerMesh is a new feature in Mocha 2021 that uses a very powerful subplanar tracking engine that lets you track warped and uneven surfaces. Now, what exactly does that mean? Instead of tracking flat objects, you can track more organic objects now, such as someone's face, their skin, or fabric with extreme accuracy. Basically, any tracking job that would normally make you want to bash your head into your computer, it'll be a breeze with how fast and accurate PowerMesh is. Now, those of you familiar with VFX, I can already see you guys in the comments below. Hey, can't I do that effect in 𝐘𝐸Synth? And yeah, you can do something similar with it. And for those who don't know, 𝐘𝐸Synth is a program that converts footage into stylized results by just feeding it one stylized frame to reference from. And although it's really cool, it's a completely different tool with a completely different working. Now, unlike 𝐘𝐸Synth, PowerMesh uses subplanar tracking, as I mentioned earlier. That means it gives you more control if you want to make manual adjustments, and the tracking data can be used for a variety of things. Use it for realistic match moves, convert it to nulls, export mats, or use it for a reverse stabilization workflow, which is what we're actually going to do today, so don't worry if you don't know what that is. With this data, you can do things like add logos to shirts, you can remove them, you can add cosmetic touch-ups, it'll make roto jobs way easier. Okay, we don't have all day to go through this list, but it's long. And this tutorial of tracking creative filters is only one of the many insane uses of PowerMesh. And remember, PowerMesh is only one of the many amazing tools in Mocha Pro. Okay, so we know what Mocha Pro is, and we know what a beast PowerMesh is. Let's learn how to use it and create this effect. Now, bear in mind, I'll be breaking down the tool the best that I can so that even if you decide tracking filters isn't necessarily for you, you can still have an understanding of how PowerMesh works and actually have it in your tool belt of knowledge. Just a quick note, if you decide that Mocha Pro is for you, stick around to the very end of the tutorial and you'll get an exclusive discount coupon. Who doesn't like to save money, right? First, you're gonna need some footage to add a filter on. There's a few things that you wanna keep an eye out for to produce the best results. Tip number one, if you're tracking something like a face in this case, I suggest shooting in a fairly evenly lit environment. Shifting shadows can cause drift in your tracking, but don't worry, I'll teach you a solution to this since we're not always handed the most ideal footage to work with. Tip number two, if you're tracking a face, I suggest taking off your glasses like what I'm wearing here. That's why you're seeing a very elusive clip of me not wearing glasses for the shot. You might want to screenshot this and be ready to sell it on eBay if one day I make it big. Bonus tip. The reason I don't suggest wearing glasses is because if you move your head around, there's some parallax between your face and the glasses, which can make the tracking job a little bit wonky, so that's something to be careful of. This isn't a problem if you're doing something like, cosmetic fixes or tracking a fake face tattoo or something, for example. But for this track where I'm tracking the whole face and my whole head, I suggest taking it off. Tip number three, I don't recommend making huge unnatural head movements since it means that you'll be introducing new things in your frame that weren't there before, and you can still stick a filter on it, but it'll require more work that I'm not gonna go over today. Once you've shot a clip of yourself making silly faces, let's dive into After Effects and turn those silly faces into works of art.
Now, before we begin, I want to quickly mention that if you want to follow along but you don't have your own footage, don't worry, we have you covered. You can download the project file that I'm using and also the footage that I'm using in the description below, so check that out. But I do recommend that you first watch through the entire tutorial once so you get a better understanding of what's going on, and then try following along with the provided project file. All right, let's begin. So once you open up After Effects, we have this footage over here that is imported, Creative Filters, OG. We're gonna drop it onto this icon over here like it's hot, and that will create a new composition just like that. So it'll fit to the dimensions and resolution of the footage. And it's just me making silly faces, of course. And now we're going to apply Mocha Pro to the clip. And in this case, I'm going to use something called Effects Console, and the shortcut is Control Spacebar. And it's a free plugin by Video Copilot that basically saves you a bit of time from going all the way to the Effects and Presets panel over here, and you can just simply type it in right here. So I'm going to type in Mocha Pro, this one over here, and it comes up in the effect control window. And before we hit this big shiny Mocha button over here, you want to make sure that the resolution is set to full. So if you have it set to half res, for example, and I click that button, it's going to give me this warning that's saying that basically it might work faster because it's lower resolution, but it might not be as accurate since there's not enough detail. So we're going to close this window, we're going to set it to full resolution, and then we're going to click that, and then we'll bypass that warning and just wait for the Mocha Pro interface to launch like this. Okay, so the workspace right now, if you take a look up top over here, right now is set to classic, but when you open it up for the first time, you might see something like this. So it's missing all these other tools in the bottom. That's because the workspace is set to essential. So just make sure that it's set to classic so we can see all these lovely parameters that we're going to play with later. Now, the first thing you want to do is determine what you actually want to track. So in this case, I'm tracking just around my head. So I'm going to take this tool over here. It looks like a pen with an X on it called the X-spline tool. And I'm actually going to track around my head first. And I'm going to break it up from my head and the rest of my body, because if I do one mask around the entire area, it can cause some problems with the track and it would be harder to manually fix. And also it would be slower in terms of the workflow because there's more to analyze. So I'm just going to focus on the head for now. And then later on, you can use the exact same steps to do the rest of the body. But in this case, let's draw around the head. And I found that I get better results when I am giving a bit of breathing room around the head like this. And I'll kind of explain why I'm doing this later. And just like that, I'll just kind of move this around. And by the way, to zoom in and out, I'm using the shortcut Z or Z if you are Canadian. And I'm holding down Z, which will give me this icon with the magnifying glass and the up and down arrow. And then I'm left clicking it, holding it down, and then I'm dragging up to zoom in, and then dragging down to zoom out. As simple as that. Okay, so this is my neutral frame where I'm not making any facial expressions, and this is the very first frame of the clip, which makes it a little bit easier. And what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to watch through the clip and see if there are any things that will potentially ruin my track and make it a little bit wonky. So these are things that may cover my face very briefly, called occlusions. So things like my hand might come up and, you know, cover my face a little bit. So if that's the case, those of you who already worked in Mocha may know that you want to track any occlusions first and then place those layers on top. So for example, if I was tracking a shirt and my hand or my arm kind of blocks it temporarily, or there's any reflections or glare on whatever that you want to track, then you'll want to track those first, so Mocha will know to avoid that when tracking what you really want later. So in this case, nothing goes over my face that would kind of block it and mess it up, but something that would mess it up are the change in shadows. So as you can see over here, this darker area is a newly formed shadow that was not here in the reference frame. So there's only a very small one over here, and then completely disappears, and then it's way more apparent if I scrub through it like this. So these newly introduced areas can cause some problems when you are tracking. So that's something that you want to be aware of. Any shadows, you probably want to track those first. And what I can actually do is if I show the layer matte, which is this button over here, show layer mattes, if I click that, as you can see, it shows the matte that is drawn with the X-spline tool. Okay, and what we can do is cut out the areas that we think would mess it up. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this, the X-spline tool over here, and we're going to go down to this one that has a cross, the add icon, and we're going to add another spline, and we're going to actually just add it here. I'm going to turn this off so I can see, and I'm going to add it around this area so it knows that it's going to kind of subtract that area like this. And I'm also going to draw around over here because I already know that that shadow is going to cause me a little bit of problems. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And then as you can see, if I turn the layer mattes on again, if I show it, then it will be subtracted from the spline that we drew earlier. All right, now before we get into tracking, we're gonna get into a bit of hefty information and we're gonna look at the parameters below over here. And we're gonna talk through them and then know what to click and what to check off, and of course, why we're doing it. Now, those of you who are familiar with Mocha AE, you already know what these are: translation, scale, rotation, shear, perspective. You've seen them before, but the new one that we're working with today is called mesh over here. So we're going to click that, and what happens is it's going to automatically create a mesh. But we've got another option that we want to change this to. We actually don't want to use the automatically generated one. So over here at mesh generation, under generation mode, you can see that it's set to automatic. So as automatic implies, it'll automatically determine where to place the mesh points based off the pixels in your footage. So this is usually good for things like smooth objects or the skin on your arm or something, or more rigid patterns that are constant. And if you ever want to add more vertices, which are these mesh points over here, what you can do is click this icon over here, which is to edit the mesh track, and we can click this, which will add track mesh vertices. and we're just gonna, click over here. Let's say we wanted some more vertices and more points for it to accurately track. So that's how you would do it. However, in this case, we're not using the automatically generated one. What we're gonna do is we're going to click this down, and then we're gonna go to uniform, which is the other generation mode. And of course, that doesn't update yet. So what we're gonna do is clear the mesh that was generated, and that's this button over here. Clearing the mesh will delete the mesh that was created, and then we're gonna generate a mesh, which will make a new mesh based off the new changes that we made. So in this case, as you can see, this is the uniform generation mode for the PowerMesh, and there are more vertices and they're more evenly spaced apart. And this is best used for surfaces that'll warp around, like your face or fabric, or may not have a lot of texture. Now, right below it over here is mesh size. Let's talk about that. That'll determine the distance between your vertices. So if the number is lower, that means the shorter the distance between your points, and it would mean that there are more points as well. A larger number would mean that there are less vertices, since the distance between them would be bigger. So right now this is set to 32, but let's say that I do a higher number. So that would mean that it's further spaced apart. So if I clear the mesh and then generate it again, as you can see, they're further apart. There are fewer vertices. However, I know that for something like this, I actually like to have it at around 25, since I'm working with Ultra HD in terms of resolution. But usually the default 35 is pretty good for HD or Ultra HD, depending on what you're tracking and of course the composition of your shot. But as I said, 25 is pretty good. So we're gonna clear mesh, generate mesh, and there are a lot of points. And bear in mind, the more points that there are, the slower your track will be, because there's more data to analyze. Okay, let's talk about the one underneath, vertices on spline, and that's whether or not you want the vertices of the mesh to be on the spline that we drew earlier. So as you can see, if I just zoom in, this is the spline, right? And just to show you a little more clear, I'm gonna hide this mesh. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the pick tool like this, and we're going to click this so it's not highlighted anymore, so we don't show the track mesh. And as you can see, this was a spline that we drew earlier. So basically, the vertices would be on the spline, just like that, right? So I'm gonna show you the difference between on and off. So if I turn this off, I'm gonna clear the mesh, I'm gonna generate the mesh. That means it's not going to be on the spline, it's going to be within the boundaries of that spline that we drew. And this is the one that I actually wanna use, because what happens is, especially this area where I subtracted from the spline, if I had the vertices spline on, I'm just gonna clear the mesh and generate it again, that kind of eats into that area that I wanted to subtract. And I don't really want that. I actually want to, let's take that off, clear mesh, generate mesh, and go back to what it was. I want to keep it this way, so that space is nice and basically bigger, while everything that I drew earlier is still within that spline. So it keeps everything on my head. All right, we're almost there. The next thing I want to talk about is adaptive contrast. So you use this for footage that doesn't contain too much detail. Basically, it'll boost the details in your footage when creating an automatically created mesh for a better track. But we're okay in this case because it's a pretty well-lit environment. There are no real dark areas that don't contain enough information. Generate mesh, as I mentioned before, generates a new mesh. Clearing mesh will delete the mesh. And let's talk about smoothness. Now, smoothness basically determines how stiff the movement is for your PowerMesh to track. So it can either lean more on the planar tracking data or subplanar tracking data. That probably sounds a little bit confusing, so let me kind of give you an example. Now, if your object doesn't warp around a whole bunch, say a piece of paper, but it'll still warp, but isn't super fluid or anything like that, then a higher value would be more effective. If you're tracking something like water where there's constant warping, then you would want a lower number. And I'm just using these examples and using this clip from the official Boris FX YouTube channel. But in this case, we'll go with the default 50, since there are some warping in the face when I'm making expressions. And if you're ever unsure, just click the auto smoothness and it does a pretty good job. Now, warp spline is the one underneath, but it doesn't actually matter in this case. Basically what happens is it'll warp the spline that you drew to remain on the edge of the subject that you basically drew over. So in this case, I drew it around the space, but if I drew the spline, say, tapered along my ear and my face, then as I track forwards, if you're already familiar with Mocha, it might drift around if I move my face because it tries to retain the size. But if you check the warp spline, basically the spline will be tapered throughout the track, so it won't move around, it'll just stay along the edge of the face or the ear, if that's where you drew along the spline. But in this case, I gave some extra room away from my head, so I don't care if it'll, warp my spline or not. So here is the exciting part. Once you've generated your mesh, let's start tracking forward by clicking this button right over here. Mocha will now work its magic. All right, so once you're done tracking, let's play it back to see how well it did. Now, in this case, as you can see, I actually made an adjustment to the track because I noticed that there was some drift that's happening due to my eyes. So I used the same method I taught you earlier where I added a new spline around the areas I want to cut out. So in this case, let's start from the very beginning. And if I just kind of scrub forward for you to see, when I start making a facial expression, you can see that the vertices track really well to the areas that move. So in this case, if I just look at my lips, for example, just over here, it'll move along the areas that begin to warp and move around. So it's kind of like magic. And even if you were to look at another area, say my eyebrows in this case, kind of like this, as it starts to move up like this, it's still tracking really well and pushing up just like my eyebrow is. Now, any drifts in the vertices can be manually adjusted by keyframing it, just kind of like how you would do in After Effects. All you have to do is go back to edit the track mesh over here. Once we click that, we can manually move the vertices wherever that we want, like this. All right, so if we scrub forward, let's say that the moment that I'm smiling, kind of like this, let's say that this vertice over here just drifts over like over here for whatever reason. And what we would do is go back to the point where it is normal, which is right over here. And then we would hit this key with the add icon and click that. And that adds a new keyframe, as you can see this green dot over here. And then we're going to go forward to the point where it drifts. So let's say that over here, it's like this, for example. What we're going to do is we would just move it back to where we think is appropriate. So if I just hold and drag like this, it'll create a new keyframe with a new position, and then it'll automate the motion to fill in the gaps in between, just like how you would keyframe in After Effects. So that's how you make manual adjustments to any of the points that might be a little bit weird and go off a little bit. But now that we have this beautifully tracked mesh in Mocha Pro, what exactly are we going to do with this? We're going to reverse stabilize the area that we tracked. So in this case, it's going to be the head, and we're going to add a stylized filter on it. Maybe that sounds a bit confusing, so let me just show you. First, you're going to want to pick a reference frame. So in this case, it's going to be the very beginning because this is a very neutral frame that shows everything. And we're going to actually show the planar surface, which is this button over here. And then you will see a blue kind of box over here. I'm actually going to hide everything if I can by just unchecking everything and then going to the picker tool like this. And then you can see this blue box. So that appears when you click this show planar surface. And what you're going to want to do, I'm just going to zoom out over here. We're going to expand the planar surface, and basically that will expand that blue box so it fits the dimension of the footage like this. And it's very important that you do this because if you don't expand the planar surface on your reference frame, it's going to do some really weird stuff. Next, we are going to go to one of the tabs over here, Stabilize, okay, on the right, and we're going to check the mesh warp. And I'm just going to show that mesh again, zoom in like this. Now, right now it's set to unwarp like this, which is what we want to do because it'll unwarp the mesh. And we're going to change the quality to high. Now we can scrub through to see what is going on. And it's unwarping that mesh, which will give some really funky results. In this case, we got a lot of these points that are hiding my face, but let me just turn that off. Oh my gosh, it's showing my true form. But basically, if I just scrub through it to see if there are any problems with the mesh as I'm making certain facial expressions. Let's take a look over here. Oh my gosh, I swear someone's going to screenshot this and make it into an NFT. Not giving you any crazy ideas, but it might be worth something in the future. So if I zoom closer over here, as you can see, there are some weird things happening along the ear over here. And what you can do is you can show the mesh like this, and you can go back to track over here, and then you can make some adjustments to some of the points over here, or know that this is the area where it starts looking a little bit weird. So you can make manual adjustments to the vertices as I taught you earlier. Now in this case, I'm not going to be too picky for this tutorial, but I just want to show you how you would make adjustments. And now it's important here that you save before you exit Mocha. You hit Control S and wait for the kind of little saving icon or the loading bar over here to finish before you close Mocha, because I've had a couple times where I tried to save it at the same time as I was closing it, and Mocha didn't like that. It just punished me for overwhelming it, and it didn't save any of the data that I tracked. So just a word of warning, not to be as hasty as I am. Once you've made sure it's saved, we can just hit the X to close the Mocha interface and go back to After Effects like this. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the Module Renders tab right over here in the Mocha Pro effect. Once we click that arrow, we're going to hit Render. That'll render whatever we did in Mocha Pro. I'm going to change the module to Stabilize Unwarp like this and set the warp quality to high, very similar to what we were doing earlier. And what we'll do is let's just hit Control D and then delete the effect from the one on the bottom. This will kind of be like our normal clip where nothing happens, and the effect is only applied to this top layer. And now what we'll do is click this, we'll hit Control C, so we copy this effect, okay? And then we're going to hit Control-Shift-C, which will pre-compose the layer. And you want to make sure that you move all the attributes into a new composition. And we'll just call this something like stable head, because that's kind of what we're doing. We're stabilizing the head. And then we're going to hit Control-V, so we paste the effect. And we're going to actually do something a little bit different. We're going to go to Module Renders over here. And instead of it being Stabilize Unwarp, we're going to say Stabilize Warp, which will reverse the stabilization. So if I just change this back to half resolution, so it's not so hard on my computer, I can show you that if I scrub forward and show you a couple frames, it doesn't look like anything really happens, which is great. All the work that's going to be done will be in this pre-comp, and we'll open that up by double clicking it. And as you can see, it shows the same kind of effect that was happening while we were in Mocha Pro. And we're going to export this reference frame, and you can either do so by saving it as a PSD or a PNG. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go to Composition, and I'm going to hit Save Frame as a file, and then it'll open up the render queue, which will by default set the output module to Photoshop. So it's going to be a PSD, and we're just going to save this somewhere. We're going to call it, I don't know, stylized filter, and we'll open that up and we'll rename this to reference frame like this. And then we're just gonna hit render, and then in less than a second, it is already done. So what we're gonna do is now hop over to Photoshop and open up that image. So at this point, you let loose your creativity and do whatever you like to the image. Now, there are plenty of YouTube tutorials on how to create certain looks in Photoshop. You can even explore the filter gallery over here and just, you know, apply whatever filter that you think would look cool. And some of them give really good results just by default, or when you hit cancel. But I don't want you to leave empty-handed while you're watching this tutorial. So I want to quickly talk through how you can make this low poly triangle look. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer by hitting Control-J, and then I'm going to take this tool over here. I'm just going to hold down so that I have this polygonal lasso tool. Don't say that very often, so it was a little bit of a tongue twister. But what's going to happen is you're going to basically draw the areas that you want to create a triangle like this, so that that area is selected now. And you're going to go to Filter, you're going to go to Blur, and then you're going to go to Average, just like that. And that's one triangle. Now you can imagine how time consuming this can be, but with a little bit of patience, it'll give you an awesome result. But luckily, every time that you draw a triangle, you actually don't have to go back to that menu and go to blur and average, because I'd go insane before I could even finish this if I had to do that. You can hit a shortcut to apply the last effect that was made. So that's Control-Alt-F in Photoshop CC 2021 right now, and that'll automatically blur it. And then if you want to deselect this, you just hit Control-D and you just keep going. You just keep drawing your triangles until you're done. But with a little bit of patience, you end up with something like this. As you can see, I did the head and I did the rest of the body, which I would do a track later. But right now I'm kind of just focusing on the head. So I'm going to save this. Now in this case, I had these previously made filters, but I'm going to save it in the same area that I had the reference frame. So you can either replace the reference frame that you were working in already, but in this case, I can always just call it stylized filter change like this and make it into a new file so you don't overwrite anything if anything ever happens. So we're going to close Photoshop and we will go back into After Effects like this, and then we're going to import that image, which is this one right over here. And we can just keep it as editable layer styles, and the composition retain layer size. Doesn't really matter in this case too much. We're going to hit OK, and we're going to go back into this pre-comp over here, and we're going to slap in that filter right on top like so. And as you can see, it just overlaps right on top, and because the background was transparent, it's just kind of slapped on top like this while still seeing the background footage. But if I were to turn that layer off down here, and then we were to go back into the main layer over here, let's just RAM preview this to see what we get. And we play it back. As you can see, damn, that is looking sick. As you can see, the design adheres to the areas that warp, such as the mouth over here. But as you can also see, there are some areas where it's not doing as good of a job over here. And what you would want to do is go back to Mocha. So you would go back over here and then go back to this layer over here with the effect, and we would go back into Mocha by hitting this button and then make any manual adjustments to the vertices. But in this case, I actually think it's quite forgivable because it's a kind of triangular, sharp-edged filter. So any discrepancies look like it's kind of part of the design. But for any filters that don't have sharp edges like this, then the more time that you spend on refining the details, obviously the better the result. But I'm just showing how you can do all this really quickly through this tutorial. And for the rest of the body over here, you would do the exact same process as I taught for the head. Just create a power mesh around the neck and the shirt and capture its subtle movements, and then you just apply the filter the exact same way with the reverse stabilization workflow. So I just placed in the layers from another composition where I spent a little more time on it. And as you can see, the background, all I did was replace it with a solid, and then I did it for the rest of the body like this, so that it tracks any kind of subtle movement along the neck or the shirt.
Congratulations guys, because you are essentially done. That's how you stick stylized filters onto moving faces using the incredible PowerMesh tool. However, what if you want to swap that filter for something else? What if you want to use multiple filters in your clip, like what I did? It's super easy, and there's a few ways how. The first way is that you can simply make changes to the original PSD file, save it, and then the file will be automatically updated in After Effects. Another way is to make a copy of your reference image and then alter it in Photoshop, and then replace the footage in AE with your new PSD file. And third way is if your new filter is a different dimension after you made some changes in Photoshop or something like that, you could always import it and then place it on top of your footage, just like how we initially did it, and then just make sure that you rescale it and reposition it so it matches the size of your face. Now, one important note is that depending on the effect that you're going for this one particularly, you want to make sure that your filter is isolated from the background by making the background transparent. Now, you can do this either by erasing it in Photoshop, or you can mask it out in After Effects or create a matte in there. All right, once you've applied everything you learned today by tracking the rest of the body and creating multiple filters, you could make some interesting transitions between your filters and have something that looks like this. All right, that is it guys. I hope you had as much fun as I did using this tool in a creative way. Now, although there are many practical applications for Mocha Pro, like cosmetic touch-ups or changing graphics, I wanted to share a stylized approach for those who just want to have fun with their creation. But keep an eye out, because there will be a tutorial where I talk about using the PowerMesh to remove or replace a logo from a shirt in your live moving footage. As I mentioned earlier, we have an exclusive discount coupon code where you can save 15% off all Boris FX plugins. Just use the link in the description and enter this coupon code right here. Save that money, guys, make it rain. I'd be making it rain with some cash for some awesome effect, but I don't have that much cash on me. Maybe I should just add it in post. Now, be sure to tag us on what you create, because Josh and I are always excited to see what you guys come up with. Let us know in the comments what kind of filter you'd like to slap on, and stay tuned to the next tutorial on the Josh Olufemi channel. There will be more tutorials from both Josh and myself and the other amazing instructors on the Olufemi channel. Now, if you want to stay in touch and see what I'm up to, you can check out my Instagram. The handle is @Coffeelicker. Until next time, my name is Herman, and let's bring it back over to Josh.
Guys, we have finished yet another incredible tutorial. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, remember to keep it chill.